First and foremost, I'd like to offer everybody a very warm welcome to this webinar on HR mediation and escalation is not inevitable. My name is Stuart Lawrence. I'm the founder of Mediator Locator, and I'm a lawyer and disputes lawyer with over 30 years of experience. I've got some slides which I'm now going to share, so hopefully everybody will be able to see my screen. Just doing that now. So if anybody can't see my screen, please say, but hopefully everybody can see it. So a very warm welcome. As I say, my name's Stuart Lawrence. I'm also going to be joined this morning by, well, we were supposed to be joined by Claire Ralston from CLR Law, but I understand Claire's son is in A&E with a issue with his ankle. So her colleague, Sarah Davini, has very gallantly agreed to step up and deliver all the slides. But Claire and Sarah are both from CLR Law, both solicitors and experienced mediators. I'm also delighted to be joined by Fiona Gray. Fiona is a workplace mediator and specialist HR business partner, and Fiona joins us from Scotland. Then we have Rachel Heenan from Capsticks law firm. Rachel is a very experienced lawyer and very seasoned mediator with a lot of mediation experience under her in her past. And then last, by no means least, we have Martin Hamilton, who is Rachel's colleague from Capsticks, and Martin is the managing partner and a mediator there as well. So as I say, a very warm welcome to everybody. I'd like to say a few words, if I may, just quickly about Mediator Locator. So who are we? So we're a free mediation referral service. We currently partner with, as of yesterday, 18 law firms. I'm delighted we're growing. We have now 31 skilled mediators, all of whom are qualified, many legally qualified, and most of the mediators are at partner level. So there's a great deal of depth and experience that we offer from our mediators. We have national coverage, as you can see from the map, all the way from Scotland across the UK and even Northern Ireland. We have two panels. We have a primary panel for higher value and more complex disputes, where the pricing is done on a bespoke basis. So an inquiry may come to me, and then I will critically review that to identify the right mediator for the particular dispute, taking into account their skills, location, complexity, seniority, etc. And then we also have a set value panel, which is for more straightforward disputes that are up to £50,000 in value with fixed fees. And if you are interested to learn more about that on the website, there's a specific page called Set Value Panel, and it has all the details on the fees there as well. We offer both in-person and virtual mediations and hybrid mediations, which is where people go to, maybe if they're represented by a law firm, they'll go to the law firm and sit with their lawyer and have the mediation online. Mediator Locator, we're really passionate about mediation. We think it can solve almost all disputes that people have. And we have a curated panel of experts, and we don't just recommend the next one in line. We take the time and trouble to understand your dispute and select the right person for it. So as I say, delighted to have everybody on board. The agenda for today is we're going to hand over shortly to Sarah, who will introduce herself, and she's going to talk about how HR should use mediation. Thereafter, Fiona and myself will be talking about neurodiversity and workplace conflict. Subsequent to that, we have Rachel and Martin, who will be speaking about investigations versus mediations and making the right call. And then at the end of the session, we have quite a long period for questions and answers. HR is a fascinating and nuanced area, and we're anticipating plenty of questions, and we'll be happy to answer those for you. If you have questions that pop up as we go, be delighted to answer them. It's helpful if these sessions are interactive, keeps it more engaged and interesting for everybody. So do feel free to ask questions and make it as engaging as we possibly can. So thank you once again, and without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Sarah, who's going to start her session of slides. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stuart. Hi, everybody. Good morning. As Stuart said, I'm Sarah Davini from CLR Law. I was supposed to be joined by Claire, but unfortunately, she's currently sat waiting for an X-ray for her daughter, who's had another football injury. So please bear with me when I'm going through the slides when I turn into Claire. I'm an employment lawyer and have been for 25 years. I'm also a civil, commercial and workplace mediator. And as an employment lawyer, I do a lot of workplace mediations, and I must say I really do enjoy doing them. I know it does me out of employment law work sometimes, but the satisfaction you get from doing a successful mediation is fantastic. So just going through our slides today, I'll be discussing when and how mediation adds real value, early intervention, so timing, scope and expectations, legal context and boundaries that HR need to be aware of. And then if we've got time, we'll look at a couple of practical examples from workplace disputes. So next slide, please, Stuart. Oh, you're ahead of me. So what is workplace mediation? Just like any other mediation, it's voluntary and it's a confidential process, and it's facilitated by an impartial third party, the mediator. And it's important that the third party is independent from anyone within the workplace when it's a workplace mediation, so that it encourages the parties to open up and to disclose information that they wouldn't necessarily disclose to someone employed within the company. And unfortunately, even HR, in-house HR, I find, is often viewed by the employees as being on the side of the employer and therefore not completely impartial. Workplace mediation focuses on restoring working relationships between the parties after a dispute or during a dispute, and finding a mutually acceptable solution for everyone concerned. And more often than not, with employment mediations, employment situations, the employees have to continue to work together. So it's important that during the mediation, bridges are built and the relationships strengthened. And unlike other types of mediation, such as commercial, where there may not be the need for the ongoing relationship, once the dispute's involved, it's important that those bridges are built. Again, as well, unlike grievance and disciplinary procedures, which you'll be dealing with probably on a daily basis, mediation is interest-based rather than rights-based. Next slide, please, Stuart. Okay, so when and why should HR consider mediation? Well, first of all, looking at when, in my view, the best time to consider mediation is at the early stages of conflict. It's not always suitable at the very early stages, but as early as you can catch it, the better. Especially where communication's broken down between the parties, or and also where the employment relationship is ongoing. I'll look at when to engage in mediation shortly, but mediation works best when both parties are willing to participate and where the issues are relational rather than purely legal or policy driven. And again, we'll look at those again shortly as well. It all goes back to maintaining and restoring the working relationship. And as we know, which I've already said already, mediation is voluntary. But I had a case recently where I'd already had the pre-mediation meeting online, and then we had a face-to-face mediation. And he told me at our first individual meeting on the day that he was told by HR that he had to take part in mediation as one of the outcomes of the grievance. He didn't seem very enthusiastic. So then I had to address it with him and obviously explain that it's a voluntary process. And after a chat, fortunately, he confirmed that he did want to go ahead with it. Why should HR take part in mediation? Well, we'll look at the legal implications of that shortly. But mediation is less time consuming and less costly than going through a formal grievance process or going to tribunal and having to go through the whole tribunal process. The mediations that I tend to do, the workplace ones, take place over either a half day or a full day, depending on the issues that are involved. And I tend to recommend a full day, because with a half day, it can seem quite rushed, and sometimes the parties can feel under pressure. So I'd usually recommend taking part in a workplace mediation over the full day. Just in terms of timings, with a tribunal claim, so if you didn't mediate, you ended up in tribunal, a typical discrimination claim these days lasts anything from 4 days plus. So I mean, there are some that last 2 weeks, 4 weeks, and certainly you don't want to be caught in one of those if you can help it. So there's a cost in terms of the time of managers attending the tribunal and preparing for the tribunal. There's the cost in terms of legal fees and defending the claims. And also there's the cost in terms of damage to the reputation of your company if you end up in tribunal. One of the good things with mediation is that the agreement is confidential. So that means that nobody should find out about the dispute in the first place. Next slide, please, Stuart. When you're considering if mediation is appropriate, you need to think about how timing impacts effectiveness, and how HR can assess suitability depending on the type of dispute taking place, because not all disputes are suitable for mediation, and also depending on the type of dispute and who's involved will depend on when the mediation should take place in the process. I've had mediations where they take place at an early stage, even before a grievance has been put in. I've done mediations after the grievance outcome, where it's been recommended as part of the grievance outcome. And I'm currently being named in a COT3 agreement, the settlement agreement for a tribunal claim, as the mediator who will mediate the dispute after the agreement has been put in place, after the tribunal proceedings have been put to bed. So that's going to be an interesting one as well. Claire was going to look at disputes between two employees, disputes between multiple employees, and disputes involving the employer themselves. But as Stuart said, I'm going to be dealing with that, because all of them need to be addressed slightly differently depending on who the individuals are. Next slide, please, Stuart. So I just need to speak to you a little bit about the UK legal and regulatory framework. In the UK context, mediation must be understood alongside the employer's legal obligations. Claire and I are both employment lawyers, which I find is a huge advantage when we're carrying out the workplace mediations, because we know the law, we know how it applies to the case and what's likely to happen if the dispute ended up in the employment tribunal, and we can guide parties accordingly. You'll all be aware of the ACAS Code of Practice on disciplinary and grievance procedures, and that requires employers to handle disciplinaries and grievances fairly and reasonably, and failure to follow that code can result in up to a 25% uplift in employment tribunal awards. So that can be quite significant. Then there's the Employment Rights Act 1996. A lot of claims can be brought in the Employment Tribunal under that, but just to touch on constructive dismissal, which is a claim that can be brought under the Act, if trust and confidence is breached, you might be faced with a constructive dismissal claim. So, for example, if you refuse to go through a grievance process and insist on mediation instead, that could potentially be a constructive unfair dismissal claim against you. Then there's the Equality Act 2010. As you'll all know, that creates obligations around discrimination, harassment, and victimisation, and allegations involving protected characteristics often require formal investigation before mediation. So you should bear that in mind. If a dispute relates to allegations of discriminatory conduct, you need to have a think about what investigation needs to take place. And I know that will be dealt with later on in this seminar. As you know, there's an increasing number of neurodiverse people in the workplace these days. So you need to make sure that you make any reasonable adjustments for them during the process so that you can assist them in making the most of the process. You should also make sure that the mediation is appropriate for them in the first place, or whether an alternative process might be more suitable, such as going through the grievance process instead. Or it may be that it's appropriate to go through the grievance process first, then have a mediation as part of the outcome. You need to be guided by the individual employee and their needs. Mediation can't replace the statutory processes where they're required, but it can complement them, and it can reduce tribunal exposure when used appropriately. So it's really important to consider the circumstances before you take action. And even if a mediated dispute ends up in tribunal, if you as the employer can say that mediation was attempted, it all points to you showing that you've behaved in a reasonable manner, which means you get some brownie points at the tribunal. And you also should ensure that mediation doesn't undermine procedural fairness or appears to suppress protected disclosures, for example. It must be made clear to employees that they're free to explore whatever avenue they feel they need to. As we all know, mediation is voluntary, and employees can be encouraged to take part at an early stage, but strength of feeling might mean that a particular employee wants to pursue legal routes instead. So again, you need to be guided by the employee. Next slide, please, Stuart. So looking at when is the best time for mediation to take place. Using mediation before a grievance is lodged can prevent escalation and reduce legal and administrative costs, as well as being time-saving. It can preserve working relationships, and it can also reduce stress associated with formal investigations. And it's a less formal way of dealing with a dispute. It also helps to catch the issues before the employee's views become entrenched. In relation to you as HR, it demonstrates a proactive, people-focused approach. However, it might be inappropriate where there are allegations of, for example, serious misconduct or harassment, discrimination or safeguarding concerns, because often they need to be investigated first. There might also be power imbalances that undermine fairness that you need to consider. And mediation shouldn't replace the necessary formal investigations where required, because as you've seen from the legal implications, you could be faced with legal claims as a result. Next slide, please, Stuart. So mediation after a grievance. After a grievance has been investigated and an outcome decided, mediation can help rebuild working relationships. I'm finding that most of my workplace mediations are mediations after a grievance has been decided, but before any employment tribunal claim's been brought in. And it really is effective, because the investigation might clarify facts, it might make the mediation more focused, and the parties might be working towards an outcome that's already been decided during the grievance process. And the mediation after the grievance can help support reintegration after that difficult process, and it can also demonstrate procedural fairness, again helping to defend any future potential employment tribunal claim that might come along. On the downside, By the time a grievance concludes, parties might be entrenched in their positions. Trust might have deteriorated. Individuals may be emotionally exhausted, and that can make mediation more difficult. I did a mediation a couple of weeks ago where both parties indicated, particularly one of the parties indicated to me at the beginning of the mediation that they were already tired of the whole process and they just wanted to get back to work and get on. But mediation was one of the recommendations from the outcome of the grievance. And it went fine, except when we had the joint meeting between the two parties, the one who'd indicated that they're tired of the whole process sat there with his arms folded, chewing gum in this position, sitting back, I don't care position. So I thought, oh, I've got my hands full here, but fortunately we got to an agreement in the end. But, you know, depending on the process, a grievance process can sometimes take a long time and parties might be tired of it by the end. Next slide, please, Stuart. So I'm now Claire. Claire was going to deal with this part of the presentation. She was going to talk about disputes between different individuals. So first of all, disputes between two employees. There can be disputes between two employees, a few employees. It can involve the line manager. It can involve people of similar level of seniority, and it could involve the employer and someone quite senior. Disputes between two employees are often interpersonal and highly suitable for early mediation, I would say. Catch it early. You as HR should assess power imbalances in these circumstances, such as if there's a manager or subordinate relationship, and be clear that you have got voluntary participation and both have agreed to take part. You don't want the less senior person to be feeling like they're being pressured into taking part in the mediation. And there should be a clear focus on communication. Often a party might tell me something confidentially and tell me that they don't want the other party to know. They don't want me to share it with the other party. And as you'll know, with mediation, you can only share information if one party's agreed to that. And quite often this information that party's given me is exactly the type of information that should be shared. So I encourage the parties to do that. And so I say to them, you know, that would be really useful if you could tell Mr. X or Miss Y. And quite often they do, they take that on board. And by them opening up, it makes the conversation flow and it builds the trust between the two employees. And next slide, please, Stuart. Then there's disputes involving multiple employees. It can be any number of employees. There might be a whole team. It might be a whole department, and the dynamics become more complex. You might need group mediation, and when you do, you might need co-mediators. One mediator might not be enough, and careful preparation is essential in these circumstances. And you as HR need to consider confidentiality, psychological safety, and whether underlying structural issues exist within the department. Claire and I were going to do a mediation for a large company a few weeks ago, and it involved 4 employees, and we had the pre-mediation meetings, and it became clear during those pre-mediation meetings that 2 of the individuals who were going to take part were not in a fit state to go ahead with the mediation. The situation had gone on for so long, they were off work sick with stress, and even talking to them for the pre-mediation meeting, it was clear it wasn't suitable. She wasn't ready to go ahead with that mediation. We haven't ruled it out for the future, but at that stage, the mediation didn't go ahead. So you might find that you have the pre-mediation meetings, or the mediator has the pre-mediation meetings, and then the mediation doesn't go ahead going forward. Next slide, please, Stuart. There might be disputes involving the employer themselves, such as grievances about management decisions. And here, power imbalance is significant. You need to ensure that your mediator is independent and external, because this is particularly where employees wouldn't want HR to be the mediator, because I know a lot of HR people are qualified. The employees in these circumstances need to be assured that the mediator is independent and impartial. And it is really helpful to not have met these people before. So when you're mediating, you have no idea about them, they have no idea about you. And it's a good way to get people to talk to you. When the dispute involves the employer, it's even more important to consider the legal context, particularly where statutory rights are engaged. And as I say, that's more important than when it's just between two employees, because you're more likely to be faced with claims if the employer is involved in the dispute than when it's two employees of maybe similar seniority. Next slide, please, Stuart. So looking at key decision-making factors for HR. You need to assess the seriousness of the allegations, the willingness of the parties to participate, because if they're not willing, then the mediation shouldn't go ahead. And also the power dynamics between the parties. You've got to weigh up all these factors. You should also consider the impact on the wider workforce, along with any legal obligations that might arise that we've discussed. Mediation shouldn't replace formal procedures where they're required, but it can certainly complement them. And next slide, please, Stuart. So looking at the practical framework for you as HR, a structured approach helps ensure that mediation is used appropriately. So you need to plan it out, you need to consider the situation, assess the suitability of mediation for that particular dispute and those particular individuals. You might do that and then decide, no, mediation isn't the way forward, or yes, certainly, let's give it a go because they're keen. You need to consider the timing carefully, whether you have the mediation before or after a grievance process is carried out. Select a skilled mediator, prepare the participants thoroughly so they know what to expect, and always follow up afterwards to sustain any outcomes that have been agreed as a result of the mediation. When I've carried out a workplace mediation, I tend to get in touch with the employer afterwards, maybe a few weeks later, to see how the relationship's going, see if the agreement is still in place, and see if everybody's still sticking to it. And it's really good to hear that I've made a difference to people's working lives by getting them to come to this agreement. And it usually has a knock-on effect of their lives outside work as well, because obviously if you're stressed at work and there's a dispute at work, it can have a knock-on effect. And next slide, please, Stuart. Right. I've prepared a couple of case studies, which I'll just run through with you, just to give you some examples of when mediation might be appropriate in the workplace and when, at what stage in the proceedings it might be appropriate as well. So, for example, this case study, there's two employees, there's a marketing manager and a senior executive, and they've got escalating tensions. The executive feels micromanaged, the manager feels publicly undermined, absence levels rise, team morale dips, but no formal grievance has been submitted. With this scenario, I'd recommend early mediation. There's no formal grievance. There's been no protected characteristic allegations, so you don't need to investigate that. There's no gross misconduct alleged. It's a primarily relational matter. So to get in early with that and try and get the employees sitting down together might just nip the situation in the bud. If the situation escalated into a grievance, then positions might harden and legal language might enter into the narrative. So catch it early in a scenario like this. Next slide, please, Stuart. So another situation. For example, a junior employee alleges bullying by the line manager and also references gender-based comments that have been made. The legal risk here you would identify is that the Equality Act 2010 is engaged. There's been references to gender-based comments. So I'd recommend here, in a scenario like this, that a formal investigation takes place first due to that discrimination allegation. And only then, once the discrimination allegation has been investigated and an outcome decided, then decide if mediation is the way forward. It might encourage reintegration, but the mediation can't replace a fact-finding scenario. So definitely need to look into those allegations first. And then next slide, please, Stuart. Another scenario with a multi-party situation. You might have, for example, an operations team of maybe 8 people. It's split into 2 factions. There's accusations of favoritism and unequal workload distribution. And in this situation, there might not have been a single grievance raised, but there might be quite a few informal complaints. You might hear rumours. In that scenario, I'd recommend a group mediation, but with proper structured pre-meetings to find out exactly what's been going on before the mediation takes place. What you'd need to consider here is the possibility of, for example, constructive dismissal claims if the environment becomes intolerable, if it's not dealt with at an early stage. And next slide, please, Stuart. And then the last case study just to look at is when there's a situation with a dispute between an employee and the employer themselves. For example, an employee being made redundant challenges the redundancy scoring and alleges that they've been unfairly selected. Well, in that situation, then there's a possible claim of unfair dismissal. So that's the risk that you would need to identify. So that's a claim under the Employment Rights Act. And in this situation, you as HR would need to ensure that the consultation that's taken place was robust and the scoring was clear and fair. So you'd need to carry out a review of that first before taking part in mediation. Once you've done that, the mediation can be used to resolve perception issues or explore settlement potentially. And that can avoid a whole tribunal claim of unfair dismissal. And the next slide, please, Stuart. So just to conclude mine and Claire's section, or my section. I'm on a course at the moment. I'm sorry, I'm getting somebody, I can hear somebody talking. Is everybody on mute, please? Thank you. Mediation is a powerful tool. It's a fantastic tool, but it's not appropriate in every situation or in relation to all employees. Every scenario needs to be addressed separately, but in the majority of the time, mediation can be used at some stage to build relationships and to improve the situation for people. Timing significantly affects its effectiveness. Different dispute types require tailored approaches, and it's your job as HR to consider this and decide when the best time is for the mediation to take place and whether the mediation should take place at all. You play a critical role in determining when and how mediation should be used to support fairness within the workplace and also organisational effectiveness. Mediation complements employment laws, but it doesn't replace the statutory processes that are required. And again, it's your job as HR to ensure fairness within your company and protect the dignity of employees at the same time as ensuring legal compliance. And I think that's all we have from us at the moment. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Sarah. Does anybody have any questions on any of that? Would you like to raise now or leave to the end, whatever you prefer? If you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask it. Otherwise, we can move on. I can't hear anybody asking any questions, so I propose to move on to the next topic, which is a topic that I'll be delivering in collaboration with Fiona, neurodiversity and workplace conflict. I think this is a really interesting topic, and I think mediation is a fantastic tool for people who are neurodivergent, because often rigid systems impose challenges for people, and with mediation it can be so much more flexible. So moving into the slides. So why neurodiversity matters in workplace conflict. And I'm going to start with a quote, if I may, which is this: when workplace conflict escalates, we often focus on behaviour, but very often escalation is driven by how our systems respond under pressure. And I think the truism here is that neurodiversity of itself rarely causes conflict. It really is the interaction between the cognitive differences people have and the rigid systems within which we have to operate. And I'm going to give a quick example, which I guess some of you may be familiar with in your roles. So you have a manager, and there's a little bit of tension between an employee and their team, and they go to the employee and go, look, you really do need to improve your tone. You know, I struggle with the way you speak to me. And the employer raises that issue, and the employee responds quite abruptly, even rudely, or maybe even defensively. And I think there's a sort of natural feeling sometimes in pressure situations of fight or flight, and you may get a reaction which is inappropriate. And then the manager feels aggrieved by this and perhaps escalates to a formal stage, and then it comes across your desk in the HR team. And the question that you probably need to ask first and foremost is what's changed? Is it the person or is it the pressure? And quite often it's the circumstances and the pressure rather than the person. And I think with workplace systems, they do tend to assume a typical type of communication system and a typical type of process. And I don't know whether any of you have been involved in a formal litigation process where you've been required to give evidence. The whole legal system and litigation system is really set up to create an adversarial environment, which is the way that the tribunals and the courts feel that you get at the facts. And that in itself can often be the issue, because people who are neurodivergent may really struggle within those framed systems. And certain people design systems to reflect their own image. And if you're very fleet of foot, you're good talking on your feet, you react to pressure, you react quickly and efficiently, then those systems work for you. But of course, we're not all built the same way. And quite often people struggle with those processes. And escalation is often procedural, not behavioural. And I think there's a few things that, ambiguity and stress can lead to an increased threat response, this fight or flight reaction, and that is driven by the process. And formality can alter a person's psychology. Pressure to respond quickly and speed can create distortion and disorientation. And as I say, escalation is often procedural, not behavioural. Moving on to the next slide. What is it we mean by neurodiversity? So neurodiversity, I'm not going to give a legal definition. So, sorry, is somebody asking sorry, forgive me, is someone asking a question, or is there oh, they just forgot to put their microphone on mute? If they could do that, that'd be great, thank you. Sorry, going back to the slide. Okay, I'll press on. I'm not going to use a medical model. What we're really talking about with neurodiversity here today is a natural cognitive variation. And to give an example of this, it's how people process information, language, attention, and it can really vary. So taking information first and foremost, different people process information in different ways. You might be somebody that likes to be spoken to. You might process information in a chat. Other people might struggle in that environment and prefer something that's much more formalized and written down. There are variations. Language can be very different. Some people are very happy to chat away. Some people interpret things in a literal way. And how many times have there been throwaway remarks where you go, oh my God, this person's a nightmare to deal with? And someone might hear that, and somebody might take that, oh well, it's just a pejorative comment. It's not really meant. It's just someone's frustrated. But somebody who interprets things literally might think, oh my God, I am actually a nightmare, and that creates escalation and pressure. Different people have different attention spans. Again, we're all different. When you're in meetings like webinars on HR matters, you might find yourself drifting off. It's not because the content isn't good. The content's absolutely great, but different people react differently, and different people have different attention spans. And it's really necessary to adjust situations. So perhaps in a meeting, you might have more breaks. Perhaps you might provide notes in advance, something of that sort. And different people react to sensory input. And one of the factors that people who are neurodivergent can struggle with is sensory input. When everybody's born, we're all born with neurons. And as we age, those neurons diminish. For some people who are neurodivergent, they don't diminish anywhere near the rate that people who are not neurodivergent diminish. So you might be in a meeting, an HR meeting. You might be sat there and you might feel the lighting's really calm, the environment's really calm, and everything's perfectly fine. The person sitting opposite you, who may be neurodivergent, is much more attuned to that sensory environment, and they might be seeing the lighting as a massive problem. They might be really stressed out by it. And we often work in offices with fluorescent lights, and they can hum. Maybe you can't hear the humming, maybe they can. And just put yourself in their shoes for a moment and think to yourself, how would I feel if I was in an environment which was pressured and then I had this sensory overload as well? It really can be very challenging. And it does exacerbate emotions and exacerbate stress, and people don't always respond in the right way. And we're familiar with different forms of neurodiversity. Common ones we often hear are autism, ADHD, which are pretty well known. Dyslexia, obviously reading can be difficult. Dyspraxia, working with numbers and struggling with numbers, and sometimes I think people can be seen as a little clumsy. And then perhaps more recently, we've seen in the BAFTAs a situation arising from Tourette's, where there was a comment made during the BAFTAs, which the media jumped on. Perhaps there needs to be a little bit more understanding of people, because it's an involuntary reaction. We are all wired differently. And I'd like to sort of give a very quick historical context and refer to what's known in neurodiversity as the societal model. So in the far past, people who are neurodivergent were often seen as the problem, and they may be seen as disabled or difficult or awkward. And as things have evolved and we've become slightly more enlightened, people are realizing that perhaps it's the society that is the issue, and it's the societal problems that create the barriers. And I'll give you a practical example. One of the trainers that we've worked with in our collaboration with the Brain Charity, who are one of UK's leading neurodiversity people, she's actually physically disabled and in a wheelchair. And she gave a great example, I thought. She said, I arrived at a building in my wheelchair, and to get into the building was steps. I couldn't get into the building. Is that a failing with her? Or is that a failing with the society in not adapting the environment to make it accessible for all people of all types and creeds? And, she can never walk up those stairs because she's in a wheelchair. We could easily build a ramp. So I think more modern thinking is it's much more about adjusting the processes and having societal improvements to make people more welcomed and accessible, and getting better outcomes. And 1 in 7 people regarded these days as neurodivergent. That's the prevailing view. So there's a good number of us who are neurodivergent around us. But people who are neurodivergent have often tremendous advantages. It's not all necessarily seen or should be seen as negative, because people who are neurodivergent can often be incredibly creative. People who are autism, who have autism, can often be fantastically precise and really good with details. I mean, to give a crazy example, we probably remember the film from the 90s, I think, Rain Man, with Tom Cruise and Dustin Hoffman. And Raymond could recite numbers and dates with unbelievable accuracy. So there is huge skills. So the point is, we're all very different. And we need to embrace those differences and cater for those differences. And not everybody who's neurodivergent is diagnosed, and not everyone needs adjustments. And the context is really what's important, and that determines the impact. But a cautionary tale, what you shouldn't do is go up to somebody and go, oh, can you tell me, are you neurodivergent and what adjustments do you need? We can all be a little bit more sophisticated and a little bit more nuanced than that. And I think the better way to approach it might be, if you've noticed someone's not engaging in a meeting or they're struggling with the information, is to say, I've noticed you may be having a little more difficulty processing this. Is there anything that we can do or I can do to help you feel more comfortable, to help you feel more involved? Would things like providing notes in advance be valuable? Would you want to take more breaks? Is the environment suitable for you? Is there anything that we can do to help you feel more part of the team? And I think those sort of simple comments and practical comments can make a big difference towards cohesion within the team. I'm just going to move on now to a little bit more on the legal framework and the legal context. And as Sarah alluded to a little earlier, many neurodiversity conditions are diagnosed as or regarded as disabilities under the Equality Act. And those disabilities require the parties to make reasonable adjustments. And it's not required to diagnose the condition under the Equality Act. It's something that you need to be alive to and actually making inquiry on and asking the types of questions I just referenced a moment ago. And it really is the impact and the knowledge that matter. So once you're aware of these things, and you should be constructive in trying to gain awareness of it, you then have to make reasonable adjustments. And as you're probably all familiar, those adjustments are context specific and proportionate. So to give you a practical example, if you're working in a very large organization which has got substantial resources, the adjustments that you'll be expected to make will be more significant because you have that capacity. It's proportionate. If you're in a small business with only a handful of employees, then again, you still need to make adjustments, but they need to be reasonable and they need to be proportionate and they need to be specific. And I think we can all see that it's not a one-size-fits-all scenario, and the legislation deliberately caters for that with more vague terms like reasonable adjustment and proportionate adjustments. So it's important to think carefully about what you need to do and be appropriate with it. And then poor processes and poor decision making can create legal and reputational risk, and that really is at the root of where we are. And people who are neurodivergent can have tremendous skills. I mean, I think there's very famous people in history who are neurodivergent. Einstein, I think, was dyslexic and may have had autism. Steve Jobs, for example, everybody is now walking around with a mobile phone in their pocket. Probably a good proportion of us have got Apple phones. He was incredibly creative and entrepreneurial and had a lot of focus on the creative side of it. And I think, one of the factors that's been a key component in the success of Apple is the fact that their products are regarded by many as beautifully designed and intuitive. And that's one of the factors that came from the creativity of Steve Jobs. Again, another example would be Richard Branson, who is dyslexic and I think maybe dyspraxic as well. And he's had huge success. So, being neurodivergent doesn't mean that there's a problem. It just means we need to understand and adapt in a societal way to create an environment that is inclusive and helpful for people. And I think if we do that, we're going to get much more value out of our employees, and people are going to feel much more engaged and a part of the team. and it's going to reduce the number of disputes that will arise in this context. But inevitably, there is going to be disputes, and with the flexibility that the mediation offers, I think it's a fantastic mechanism to adapt in a more sort of subtle, nuanced way to allow people to have the opportunity to address their grievances and resolve them. And in the employment context, where relationships are key, going through an adversarial, aggressive and rigid process can exacerbate the relations. Going through mediation can not only preserve relations, but it can actually enhance those relations. So I'm just going to finish with another quote, if I may, which is this: the legal test focuses on the effect, not the label. I'm now going to hand over to Fiona, who's going to give us some examples of where processes go wrong. Thank you very much. Over to you, Fiona.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for introduction, Stuart. I'm speaking to you all from a very, very wet, very blustery and cold Edinburgh this morning, but it's good to see so many of you on the call. Thank you for joining us. My connection to Stuart and Mediator Locator is not so much as I'm not at all as a legal professional, but I'm an HR professional. And I work predominantly now in the world of workplace mediation. So the firm that I consult with is a firm called Anderson Strathern LLP. They're a large Scottish independent law firm, and I work with their employment law department. I resonated with so much of what Sarah said earlier. Sarah comes at some of this with a legal lens. I come at some of this from an HR lens. One thing I wanted to say just before I talk specifically about where processes commonly go wrong is that since going as a freelance workplace mediator, I've worked very closely with the regulatory body in Scotland, who have clients all over the UK, but predominantly they work with third sector organisations, and that's been quite enlightening for me in a number of different ways, having been through a corporate career most of my life. And one of the observations I would make, and it's just based on my own experience, is that proportionately I've come across more neurodivergent individuals in mediations involving the third sector. Now that may be that the third sector or the voluntary sector or charity sector, whatever people choose to refer it to as, are less good at masking, or I suspect they are more relaxed at talking about these things, much more inclusive. Anyway, that's just me sharing my experience and my own observations about where I'm working at the moment. Important to recognise that from an HR perspective, the last 10 years, there's been significant movement in terms of how we have moved towards being much more inclusive. Processes and policies have changed significantly. Just take a look at your own recruitment processes today, much more inclusive and encompassing for future employees. But I would ask the question, whilst we're all now taking part in quite often mandatory training, but regular training on how to be inclusive and how not to discriminate, how well are we supporting the line managers who very often we are asking to lead a formal process? Quite often in my experience, a line manager will be invited to lead an investigation or a grievance, and it's maybe the first time they've done that. It's certainly not something they do every day, and they feel uncomfortable. And then when you add in the complexity of perhaps one party or maybe more parties being neurodivergent, then that adds more pressure on them. So it's something for us just to be aware of and make sure that we are supporting these people as best we can. So I've got a scenario here whereby if, for example, the line manager says to an employee, I need you to be more collaborative in the way that you're working. The employee, the neurodivergent employee, might find that a fairly ambiguous statement, and it might trigger anxiety in the employee in a way that it might not trigger anxiety in a typical employee. It may be that the structure of the process that you already have in your organisation feels very formal to the neurodivergent employee. Maybe the meeting is imbalanced. Maybe there's a panel of people sitting. Perhaps the line manager, there might be an HR person represented, there might be union represented from both sides. It might be that the format of the meeting is too quick fire, too many questions being asked very quickly. All these things will increase anxiety, more so if the individual has neurodivergent characteristics. To give you an example of a case I'm working on just now, one of the employees, it's a three-party workplace mediation. One of the employees has had a diagnosis of ADHD and RSD. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with that is rejection sensitivity dysphoria. It's very common with individuals with ADHD, sometimes with autism as well. And having RSD for this particular individual means that the slightest form of anxiety in meetings, she bursts into tears. And she'll say, it's okay, just carry on with the meeting. But actually, the people in the meeting with her find that really difficult to deal with, as any of us would. But if one of your colleagues is partaking in a meeting is in tears. So what can we do to fix some of these things? In terms of a process in your own organisation, consider whether your employee would benefit from having an agenda ahead of the meeting. Consider if the questions that you want to raise during that formal process could be put to the employee in writing in advance. Identify whether there should be better structure attached to that meeting, perhaps individuals speaking in turn, and make sure that you keep summarising what has been discussed. And as Stuart has alluded to already, make sure that the room itself is comfortable for the employee. I did another workplace mediation, it was tail end of last year, and again it was 3 employees, and we sat in the dark for most of the mediation process because the lighting was insufficient. Well, the lighting was too bright, and they chose to sit with a very dim light on. So making sure that the environment is well prepared and making sure that you keep adjustments ready to mind as you're going through the formal process will be really, really helpful to the employee. So I'm not going to cover whether something is suitable for mediation or whether it's more suitable for a formal process, because I think that's been covered really clearly by Sarah and Stuart. But just to emphasise, do be careful ahead of your formal process meeting to identify that there is no clear misconduct in this case. And do be careful to make sure that the employee is kept well abreast and informed about exactly what was going on. Next slide, please, Stuart. Yeah, so I'd just like to start this slide by reminding us all that practical adjustments or reasonable adjustments, we make them all the time, whether somebody is neurodivergent or not. So, for example, we offer employees flexible working contracts because they need to pick up their child at a certain time every day. We might offer an employee a phased return when they return to work after a long-term surgery. We might offer an employee a translator because English isn't their first language. So we're already making adjustments all the time. And whilst it's important to make reasonable adjustments for anybody with a disability, whether it's recognised as a disability or not, if that is what they are seeking, it's also important not to attach a stigma to this, in my view, because to go back to Stuart's point earlier about all the fabulous qualities that neurodivergent people bring to the party, we should be embracing those qualities, and not dismissing them, and not identifying these people necessarily in a minority group. So in terms of practical or reasonable adjustments, what I'd also like to just mention here is that, again, Stuart referenced 1 in 7 employees maybe have a neurodivergent personality trait. Another statistic is that 2/3 of employees don't actually communicate to anybody that they have a neurodivergent personality, either because they don't know themselves or because they choose not to. So just be mindful of that. But in terms of reasonable adjustments, consider what would be practical. The examples on the slide here are following up with a meeting in writing, giving employees extra processing time, the structured meetings, and offering breaks. To give you another example, I saw recently a reasonable adjustment paper from a client who has an ADHD employee. It was 22 pages long. Now, I would find that overwhelming. I think most of us would find that overwhelming. So just be careful to make sure that what you're doing is manageable, it's reasonable, it's practical, and that giving individuals balance is really important. Small adjustments can make all the difference. I'll give you another example. It was suggested to one employee that they were given extra time to meet a deadline, and this was a reasonable adjustment, or it was considered to be an appropriate reasonable adjustment, but when it was reviewed, the employee didn't need extra time, because all that meant was that they procrastinated even more. So giving them a very specific deadline, and not necessarily a long lead deadline, then started to work for the employee. So next slide, please, Stuart. So for me, this is all about offering people the mediation, as opposed to another form of more formal process, bearing in mind all the points that Sarah raised in her presentation as to when mediation is more appropriate. But mediation is much less judgmental, and for me, it's a kind, empathetic process if you catch it at the right time and with the right subject matter, and deal with it appropriately. It gives the parties that sense of autonomy. They make their own choices, they make their own decisions, which, for my mind, is one of the key reasons why mediations, whether with neurodiversity or not, have such a high success rate. I'd just like to finish this by using a quote which I've borrowed from somebody else. It's a quote that relates to mediation generally, but actually I've borrowed it in the context of neurodiversity. And it's from a barrister in London, a lady called Simone Bowman. And she says, mediation does not erase difference. It creates the space where difference can be understood safely. And for me, that encapsulates what we're talking about today in terms of neurodiversity. So next slide, please, Stuart. Okay, so it's over to those of you on this webinar this morning to consider a couple of questions. Where in your organisation does escalation first start? would be the first question, and closely followed by what small changes could reduce the pressure and catch that earlier. So I'm just going to put that out to the group of, we've got 30 on the call. I wonder if anybody can come off mute and share their observations on those two questions. No one?
I
Okay.
think maybe they're saving their questions to the end.
Yeah. Well, we'll assume that. So what I would say then is, in terms of what small processes could you change, you could consider providing a written agenda in advance. You can make the process feel more empathetic and less formal by perhaps changing the word disciplinary to a review meeting. And consider trialing any potential reasonable adjustments ahead and continually review them. But most of all, keep things practical and transparent with the employee. So I'm going to hand back to Stuart now.
Thanks, Fiona.
Key takeaways.
Lovely. I'm very interested. Yeah, just a few things really to pick up. Neurodiversity doesn't require new principles. It requires better process choices. And I think some of the key messages about looking at the language, looking at the way the meetings are structured, how we can improve things, is really important. And I think we all need to exercise curiosity. We need to make sure that we're looking at what's best. We need clarity around how we operate our systems. And those systems need to be flexible and proportionate. And I'm going to close with another comment, which is in many escalated disputes, the issues are manageable. It's simply the timing of the system and the rigidity of the system that made it combustible. And I think that's an absolutely true remark. And I think Fiona's quote as well was a good one. It's very clear the system should adapt to the individual. And if we exercise those adaptations intelligently and efficiently, we can head off a lot of problems. So I think that concludes the section on neurodiversity. Just a couple of very quick things, may not be directly relevant, but we're running some mediation awareness training on neurodiversity on the 24th and 25th of March, which is in conjunction with the Brain Charity. If anybody's interested, please get in touch. But also a little plug for the Brain Charity, if I may. They do run specific HR related courses to help people have greater understanding and greater awareness of neurodiversity in the workplace. And if anybody would like to get in touch with me, I can put you through to the head of training at the Brain Charity, or do jump on their website and look at the information there. They're a very good organisation, and they have very good programs that may be of value to you. So thank you, Fiona. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Martin and Rachel to take us through the next topic. Thanks ever so much.
Thank you, Stuart, and thank you, Fiona. Good morning, everybody. You've probably worked out that I'm Rachel. I'm not Martin. I'm an employment lawyer of 30 years. Been doing mediation for about 8 years now, and I also work with Martin, running a law firm called Capsticks. So we've seen these sorts of issues at all different levels, both as client, mediator, and lawyer. Our main practice now is mediating workforce issues. And when I became a mediator, I thought a lot of it would be around, doing settlement agreements for tribunals. But actually, most of the practice is around trying to restore good relations in the workplace, particularly where, employee retention is probably one of the highest risks for employers these days. Martin, are you going to introduce?
Yes, thanks, Rachel. I'll just introduce myself and then hand back to you. We're going to do this as a two-hander. And thanks, Stuart, for having us today. And good morning, everybody. Yes, so I'm also an employment lawyer of around 30 years standing. And during those years, I've headed up Capsticks employment practice nationally. But for the last sort of 9 years or so, I've been Capsticks managing partner, working closely with Rachel I'm a more recently accredited mediator, but I also have lots of years of experience advising HR clients and their organisations, both on sort of best practice around process and also around mediations. So hence today's theme in this section of this morning about the balance between investigations or mediation.
And we've called it that because that early decision, often made under pressure with incomplete information, can have a disproportionate impact on outcomes. And it's always a bit of a judgment call, isn't it, when you're faced with that dilemma. So our aim today is to outline the opportunities to pause, step back and choose the right tool, if we can call it that, for the job, rather than the most familiar one. There's no template for every organisation. It's a judgment call, and an employer will quite often have to explain their thinking before the employment tribunal if it gets there. And a tribunal won't normally criticise an employer if they've been reasonable. And tribunals also are realistic enough to recognise the tension that often comes with dealing with people. So that's what the session's about today.
Thanks, Rachel. And Stuart, could we have the next slide? So a little bit, I think we've got a heading still to come. If you can do the next click. This is sort of starting around, oops, no, sorry. If you back a slide, sorry, Stuart. Yes, so starting with a bit about what not to do, because I mean, lots of problems here can arise from, I guess, entirely understandable instincts when, as you know, Rachel's just said, you might be under pressure to make an early decision because it's clear that something isn't working. So I think the first sort of cautionary point is around not defaulting to investigation for every complaint. You know, because getting into an investigation process can feel like the safe thing to do because it's structured, you know, it's defensible if you get to tribunal. But the difficulty there is it can also escalate relatively, well, it escalates issues, doesn't it, and into entrenched disputes. So, I mean, I think a number of organisations that we're working with increasingly are recognising that and thinking about having early dispute resolution policies, perhaps it's something, a freestanding process in itself, to encourage everybody to think about early dispute resolution. So that's one issue. Another issue to look out for is making sure you're not using mediation to avoid a difficult conversation within a team or between managers and the staff that they look after, because mediation is it's not a substitute for grasping the nettle when you've got a management decision to take. You know, it's not there to be used to sidestep perhaps a serious allegation, and we do sometimes find ourselves, Rachel and I, as mediators, having to push back on saying, well, actually, that's an employment situation for you to manage rather than a relationship, relational problems that where we can definitely help. You know, we also see, I mean, think about not allowing complainants themselves to dictate the process, whether you're in an investigation stage or whether you're in a mediation. You know, you do get to control the process. I mean, that's not to say that listening isn't vital. It really is, but the responsibility sits with the organisation to choose the right process. I mean, delay is something we also see as a major risk, which can be incredibly frustrating for the organisation, because not that you've done anything wrong, it's just delay itself. It can become an issue. So don't rush into process, but it is important to be clear on your route really early on, because delay erodes trust. That's the risk. I mean, it creates uncertainty, and inevitably that can lead to mistrust, even if even if you eventually get on the right track. The last point for me, and back to Rachel, is don't try to run an investigation and mediation simultaneously, because you can end up with the kind of worst of both worlds. And in a lot of mediations we've completed, the issues are long-standing, and it's just that people haven't talked. So that's sort of one thought from me about I mean, you can go from one to the other, and we can talk about that in a moment, but don't run the risk of getting them entwined. So I think we're on to the next slide. Yep, thanks. Oh, you're on mute, Rachel.
I think I was muted automatically. I'm glad we've got the headings back. When things are complicated, I always like to go back to basics and say, okay, let's just think about what these processes are. So let's be clear about what an investigation is actually for. It's a formal fact-finding process to establish what happened based on the evidence. So it's not a disciplinary in itself, although it can be very stressful for people. It's not about deciding outcomes or sanctions. Those steps come later, if at all. Problems arise when investigations are used to manage relationships, send signals or provide reassurance, and they are designed for objectivity, but they are not designed for restoring or healing relationships. And when used outside that purpose, they obviously cause harm. But there are some circumstances where it is really important that you do an investigation. And I think, Sarah, you referred to the fact quite often as mediators, we're presented with a grievance and the employer wants, or an investigation employer wants us to sort it all out. And you have to make the distinction between the two processes. So Martin's just going to pick up about when you should actually investigate.
Yes, thanks, Rachel. So next slide, thanks, Stuart. So these are the kinds of situations where really an investigation is not optional. So if you're, and Sarah, I think you sort of referred to some of this earlier in your section of this morning. So definitely where you've got allegations of very serious misconduct, or you think that that's something that could lead to a disciplinary process, potentially dismissal, if there's suspected criminal conduct, or you've got a complainant who's blown the whistle on something. If you've got really complex grievances, if you're a regulated organisation, we'll talk about that a bit in a moment. But if this is an issue where you might actually need to report something up to your regulator, of statutory matters such as health and safety issues, I mean, that mediation. You may come to a mediation further down the track, but you're firmly an investigation process if you're dealing with these sorts of issues. So the priority is to get an investigation underway and an outcome of that investigation, because you're going to need an audit trail, essentially, a defensible audit trail to protect the organisation's best interests and in the interests of everybody concerned. So from a governance perspective, I mean, whether there's a statutory regulator or an employment tribunal further down the track, they will want to see your structured decision making. So that's absolutely where you need an investigation process. And trying to deal with that informally, or trying to have the idea that you might want to take it offline into a mediation, actually you could find yourself increasing rather than reducing your exposure.
So what do you need in a formal investigation? What are the key features? I mean, quality matters in an investigation. In order to defend any investigation further down the line, you need an appropriate independent investigation officer to be appointed, a clear scope or terms of reference. So what are you actually asking them to do? Realistic timescales. You often see terms of reference there, the report within 2 weeks, and 8 months later, we're still waiting for the report. Structured interviews and proper evidence gathering, because depending on the outcomes, you may well end up in a tribunal where those sorts of things will be forensically looked over. Crucially, the report has to focus on findings of fact, not opinions, recommendations, or disciplinary sanctions. That's for the employer to make that decision, not the investigator. And when investigations unravel, it's often because these clear steps or boundaries have not been set out, so it becomes a bit blurred, or because as the investigation has gone along, the focus has shifted without any explanation or without any review of the terms of reference. Now, it's perfectly legitimate for an investigation to sort of change shape as you find information, but you have to go back and amend the terms of reference. They're the sort of clear rules that you need for a safe and defensible formal investigation.
Thanks, Rachel and Stuart. For the next slide. So we're still on the cautionary tales bit of our presentation, but we're going to come to the positive aspects of mediation in a moment. But I mentioned sort of the regulatory framework if you're that kind of organisation just a moment ago. So just building on that, I mean, there are clearly situations we're not investigating. And, that in itself can create significant sort of risk. To think ignoring or minimizing serious allegations, that can expose you to legal and reputational damage. So, I mean, if you're a regulated organisation on the call, I mean, whether you're regulated as perhaps the Care Quality Commission if you're in health and social care, I mean, there's the SRA if you're in legal, financial conduct authority, charity commission, and so forth. I mean, they're all going to see inaction as a governance failure if you've got a serious issue and you might have chosen mediation too early. No, it's always worth keeping your options open and thinking about that further down the track. But you've got to get your audit trail in good order if you're in that sort of situation. Also, if you're facing the risk of external escalation, that would be another red flag. So if you've got a situation where the individual who might have blown the whistle or raised the concern feels that as a concern in itself that's not being taken seriously, they're far more likely to go outside your organisation. Again, possibly to your regulator, perhaps other professional bodies, or that's when they might seek legal advice, and suddenly you find yourself in an escalating situation. So if you've got that sort of situation that you're facing, it can be better to work through an investigation process. And once that investigation process is concluded, consider whether or not mediation is appropriate at that point. That could be based perhaps on the investigator's recommendations, or perhaps where it's just clear following the investigation that relationships you're much clearer about the lay of the land where relationships have become strained and if there's scope to repair those relationships. Bear in mind, a mediator is not a decision maker. I mean, as mediators, we're here to facilitate, discussions that can create more creative outcomes. And Rachel will turn to that in a moment. But in these sorts of red flag situations, investigations, and that may not be the comfortable option, but they're usually the right option at that point.
So if we turn now to mediation, I'm at risk of repeating what my colleagues have said, but actually it is worth repeating because it quite often gets forgotten and you have to tell the parties. I think people come to mediation expecting you to give a view on who's right or wrong, and it's very different to being a lawyer or a HR expert. Everyone knows it's voluntary, it's confidential. The mediator doesn't decide who is right or wrong. You enable the conversation, and it's very much forward thinking, forward looking. How do we coexist from here, given where we are? How do we look forward? And the distinction really matters. It's not about finding out the truth, because I don't believe actually the truth tends to exist. There'll be something in the middle in terms of recollection and who is right or wrong. But it's about restoring functionality in the working relationship, and that's why it's so powerful. That's why it's so important. But it's worth us looking about where mediation works best in the scenario of an investigation, which Martin's going to pick up.
Sure, thanks, Rachel. Sure, for the next slide. Yes, so here are the sorts of examples of the sorts of situations where, in Rachel, in my experience, mediation is often the better option. I mean, what all these situations have in common is that the issue is, it's fundamentally relational rather than any behavioural as such. So, what is relationship breakdowns, interpersonal conflict, communication failures, or sort of low-level grievances? You can't quite put your finger on it. We've all been there. We just, it's just not working, is it? But there's nothing we can really flag up that would be something to investigate, or something that we might invite somebody to take a grievance forward if they're unhappy. So you're not quite at the threshold of formal investigation, but you definitely your gut instinct tells you that there's something not working. So that's where, if you're the HR professional in the room, and you're looking at process early on, that's where mediation can be particularly effective, and it might be you're in the kind of pre-mediation stage, and that's where we can come in and offer a sort of just an initial chat through process, because doing that, if you're there in the situation before positions really harden, perhaps after the conclusion of an investigation, that's where you're probably in a better position where there's prospect of being able to restore trust. I mean, one helpful test that we sometimes think about is, what's your primary need? I mean, are you looking for a resolution of a situation rather than a specific management call, a management decision on something? That's definitely where you should be actively considering mediation. Sorry, that was my doorbell, if anybody wondered what the ring was.
We often joke that's his well, I don't know what day it is, Thursday wine delivery. It's around 11 o'clock. I mean, the advantage of mediation, you're all here because presumably you're either interested in it or you believe in it. And other speakers have dealt with it much more eloquently. But actually, it's really important to remember that it's about the future, not about blame. Alongside Martin's helpful test, it's confidential, it's without prejudice, and it empowers the parties to shape their own outcomes, which I think is really important. I mean, Stuart will have the statistics more than me, but from the mediations that we conduct, 99.9% of them are really successful. And so if you think about the number of tribunals that have been avoided because of mediation, and it's things like recruitment costs, people staying in organisations when resources are very limited. It's just such a powerful tool. Next slide, please.
Well, I think it's back to me. So there are, I mean, there's just worth thinking about where the boundary might lie between when mediation is not appropriate. I mean, some of those we've touched on it before. And where the sort of serious allegations in play, but it is generally very effective around getting ongoing working relationships to a better place. But that's not going to be appropriate for these sorts of serious allegations, or sexual harassment, criminal, where there's allegations in play of criminal conduct, or you've got legal or regulatory, where you need to get to a finding in order to get a decision on the next steps. I think Sarah and Fiona, you've both talked about power imbalance, a critical issue. So you've got very senior management on the one hand, and within an organisational hierarchy, more junior colleagues. Definitely, that's where you'd be. I think Sarah, you talked about the importance of thinking about a mediator completely independent of the organisation. We definitely recommend that. Trust is so important for a successful mediation. So think about, if you've got that kind of imbalance in the scenario, if that can't be perhaps properly managed within the context of a mediation is going to be tricky. But again, a preliminary call to sort of talk that through can often be helpful, because you need really honest conversations at the heart of mediation. We've all talked about the voluntary nature of mediation for everybody concerned, and that must be genuinely voluntary. If there's any sense that participation is pressured, the integrity of a mediation is so critical. Look, in practice, as mediators, helping you, we could never get into a mediation, and we could never get that off the ground unless we were absolutely clear that all parties were agreeing to participate entirely voluntary. There's not much paperwork involved in the mediation, but the mediation agreement at the outset is absolutely critical. Confidentiality and the voluntary nature of the mediation is something that we would all really emphasise in that and that set-up stage of the process.
So what we thought would be helpful, we sort of pull together a sort of decision-making framework for you. If you're faced with this sort of decision, and it's meant to be practical. So start by triaging the complaint. What's actually been alleged? How serious is it? Does it fit into those category of things that must be investigated? Do you need a formal finding of fact here? Is that actually going to take any further? And are there any legal or regulatory obligations that will apply? And in these situations, I always like to fast forward to the end, whether it's a tribunal or an inquiry, and what will people say, what will people want to know, and what will they say you should have done at that point in time? Then consider the parties, their vulnerability is important, their preferences. Do you need an ongoing working relationship? They're all key factors. And your duty of care as an employer, what needs to happen to enable them to do their job well going forward? How do you create the environment for these people to thrive at work? And then you need to make a decision, and you need to document the rationale. As I said at the beginning, the tribunal is not going to criticise you for a reasonable decision. You just need to explain what factors you took into consideration when you made that decision. But also keep that decision under review, because stuff comes out that you think, oh, actually, that does change. Don't be so afraid to change your decision and say, actually, now I've thought about it and I've reflected on it. That shows that you're actually genuinely trying to resolve things properly. And processes and perceptions and information change. So have that flexibility to shift. The questions just come in, so I'll look at that while Martin does and we've done a matrix for you as well.
Love a matrix. So Stuart, next slide, please. I won't spend too much time on that, because this is really linked to that triaging process which was just described. We thought that, Stuart, I know you're going to be circulating the pack after the presentation, but we thought this matrix would be really helpful takeaway for you to help put all these considerations sort of together. So scenario, primary risk, recommended process, and whether that's investigation or mediation. So that's really to bring that all into one place as a kind of ready reckoner for you.
Stuart, there's a question that's come in that has disappeared off my screen, so if you could just pick that up for me at the end and we can answer it.
No trouble, we'll do.
Thank you. And I'll just say a little bit about supporting managers. Managers are often the first point of contact and frequently under-equipped. They feel under-equipped to make the investigation versus mediation call. So they need that support in making the right decision. They need that early HR guidance. But also it's important to reinforce that mediation is not a soft option. It requires skill, preparation and commitment. It's not about giving the problem to someone else. You've got to fully invest in it as an employer. And it's also important to train managers to have those initial confident conversations around what's going on without accidentally conducting an informal investigation. I think everyone sort of panics when things are brought up and immediately go to what does the process say, without sort of taking a step back and saying, actually, what's really going on here? And I think that's why a lot of employers have brought in this sort of early resolution policy and procedure to try and capture that and to avoid stressful processes for everybody. And by taking those steps, it can dramatically improve outcomes and resolve conflict very, very quickly in the workplace.
Thanks, Rachel. Just final thoughts from me on that is key takeaway from the two of us is that if you're looking to repair relationships or get them to a better place, that's where mediation is really invaluable. But if as an organisation, if you need formal findings, then an investigation process is generally where you'll be at. But at the very least, that will be at the outset, when things may be starting to go wrong. And bear in mind that there's also an opportunity when whoever you've appointed to the investigation, or if you're running that yourselves, to then sense check at the conclusion of the investigation, right, is this now a point to consider mediation? So it's not a binary process. Keep both under review, but as long as you're clear at any given point which process you're in, you'll be getting things to a much better place.
Thank you very much, Rachel and Martin. That's been very, very helpful, and thank you, everybody. A few questions are coming in on the chat, so I'll read them out and be grateful for anybody's answers. So the first one is from Claire. Have you ever dealt with mediation when two employees could not repair the relationship, i.e. the mediation failed? And what options would you consider to be available after this?
you want me to go first, and then other colleagues can join? Yeah, I had one pretty early on, and because I'd explored with the employer what although they're not party to the mediation, what outcome they were looking for. Early in the mediation, the employee said to me, "I just can't go on anymore like this. I want to leave." And so she gave me permission to talk to the employer about doing an exit for her. So the mediation very quickly turned not into rebuilding relationships, but into a settlement agreement. So I think you've got to keep your options open during the mediation and be guided by the parties as to what they want. Quite often you get into that conversation where people have gone down that I just want them sacked, and as a mediator you have to say, well, actually, is that realistic? From what you've told me, there's probably not enough here for them to get sacked. So how are you going to deal with that when the disciplinary hearing doesn't go the way you want it to do? So it's about holding the mirror up to people and being realistic. But I'm sure others have got other examples.
Does anybody want to jump in on that, or
Yeah,
shall
I'd
I
just
move on?
say on
Yeah,
that, Barry, sorry.
I was just going to add, I've had a few examples where through the process of the mediation, parties have heard, they have gathered insights that they didn't have before, and they've come to their own conclusion that actually the best way forward for them is to actually resign. And as a mediator, I used to struggle with that a bit, but actually it was a choice that the party made. It wasn't a decision put on them, and it resolved the issue for the client. So over the years, I've become more accepting that actually, if the conclusion is that one of the parties decides to move on and look for new opportunities, then it's not necessarily a failed mediation.
Thank you, Fiona. Anybody else have anything they'd like to add?
Yes, I was going.
Sorry. Yep.
I was just going to. I had trouble coming off mute there. Yeah, I was just going to add. I agree with what Fiona said. I haven't had a situation where we haven't come to an agreement as such in the mediation, but I have had a strong feeling at the end of the mediation, and even though the agreement's in place, that one of the parties was going to start looking for another job, that they were one of these people where the job wasn't their life, and they actually said that to me, and they didn't say they were going to move on, but I did get the impression that although they had come to an agreement, they're going to put the feelers out and then probably move on in the next few months.
Okay, thank you very much. Had another question from Fidelsa. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Is it appropriate for a line manager to mediate between their team members? Anybody got any thoughts?
I would say no. It's fine for them to discuss the situation, but I think when it comes to mediation, you need somebody completely independent, and a line manager, there's a risk that one or both of the employees might think that the line manager favours the other employee. And also, I find that employees don't necessarily open up to the line manager like they would an independent mediator. So I would say I do on the side of no with that.
Yeah, I agree.
I agree, yeah.
I think what's very useful is for a line manager to have coaching skills to talk to their employees, but the minute they step into the role of a mediator, the boundaries around confidentiality are blurred. Yeah. So, further down the line, let's say it doesn't work, and they say, well, you told me in that mediation. It's like, so how do you respect the confidentiality?
I couldn't agree with you more. For me, it's the confidentiality point. One of the skills that the mediators have, and one of the strengths of the process, is that people can speak candidly to the mediator, and that information isn't going to be shared beyond that discussion unless there's consent given. So if a line manager were in that situation, as Rachel has identified, they would have too much information to be able to allow them to have that credibility with the people disclosing the facts that are sensitive to them.
And I think quite often the line manager may be part of the problem. because they have not managed the employee, or they have not given the employees feedback.
I would agree. I think one of the messages that's come over loud and clear to me, and I hope to the audience of HR professionals today, is that there is real benefit in going externally for mediation. And I would add, and I don't think it's been covered so far, very often, in fact, most often, the mediation would take place on a neutral site, so it would not be in the office environment. It's just another layer in terms of reassuring the parties of total confidentiality. So I was pleased to hear Sarah talk earlier around HR not really being confidential, and as an HR professional, I recognise that, I get that. So my message to everybody here is, if you can, go externally, because you will get a better outcome.
Very good.
And it's a step-by-step process, right? And your trust is built at many layers. So we'd always do what we call a pre-mediation process, so which is confidential. Say the organisation be the sponsor of the process, but for the trust and integrity of the mediation process, really. So what you're building up trust at every stage, starting with confidential one-to-ones with everybody involved, and on the understanding that nothing will be shared from that one-to-one without consent, and that is a really important, quite powerful part of the process. So there might not be, I think the question earlier was about, have you ever had a mediation that's failed? I think it maybe not never, but not now. It's a real step-by-step process.
That comment. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, Stuart. I was just going to say, myself and Sarah had a mediation that we were both working on, and we did all of the pre-mediation meetings, and then it became very apparent that there was a real issue with HR in terms of how certain messages have been, or how things have been dealt with in the past, and how certain things were being communicated at the time. It was very difficult when we had to feed back to our HR contact, because there was 4 participants, and some of them had given us consent to discuss certain issues, but others hadn't, and it was a very, very delicate situation. That one never ended up actually going ahead, because it was identified that the issues were not really suitable for mediation, even though the company was really trying to find some method of resolution. I think it turned out really that the issues were far greater and weren't suitable for mediation amongst the individuals. It was a higher up in the organisation problem, which was obviously quite difficult for us to communicate that back to the company, and we had to do so in a really, really delicate way.
That's helpful, and also picking up on your comment, Claire, which I think is a really good one, about people going to mediations with entrenched views. It sort of follows from Rachel's comment about statistics. So just a couple of quick statistics. So I think something in the order of 80 to 85% of mediations settle on the day itself. And then within a few weeks after, that percentage goes up to over 90%. So it's a very, very high probability of getting an outcome. And Claire's comment feeds into this as well, because she gives reference to a grievance where ultimately the parties didn't go to mediation, but the parties did go to mediation. It didn't resolve the issue, but it helped to really narrow the issues. And I think that feeds into the statistic that even if you don't settle on the day, there's a very high chance that you'll resolve very quickly thereafter, because you can use the mediation as an opportunity to really get to the grips of exactly what is at the root of the problem. And then even if you don't fix it on the day, which you're most likely to do, you can ruminate and hopefully come to a conclusion relatively quickly thereafter. I think that's a really insightful remark, and definitely one that resonates strongly with me. There's another question. I'd be interested to know if there's any specific tips on recommending mediation to 2 individuals who need to work together but do not like each other due to an incident that happened outside of the workplace. Thoughts?
I would always say in that scenario, let me have a quick chat with them and talk to them about the benefits of mediation, and then they can make a decision.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
I
I've never had anyone say, "Oh, I don't want to mediate," after that discussion.
I mean, there's so many benefits, isn't there? I mean, we've alluded to them, but I think particularly in the employment context, where relationships are absolutely the core of everything that's done. If you go to an adversarial process, as soon as that process really starts, it's very difficult to walk that back. Whereas in the mediation environment, where people have security and safety in being candid, it's so much more powerful to allow the opportunity to express your feelings and thoughts, get that information out there, get it shared if you wish it to be shared in an appropriate way. And I've seen mediation actually enhance relationships, not just retain them. People get better and deeper understandings. It can be quite cathartic as a process. So yeah, I think it's
and
hugely
the other thing I'd say is the importance of like a behaviours agreement. You can actually get quite specific in the outcomes of a mediation. Say, well, what do we want to you can think of specific examples of how we might work together, and then you get we're here to facilitate, and encourage parties to be, bring an open mind and be creative, because it's the creativity of the mediation process that I think is such a magic ingredient. You don't get that degree of creativity in other more formal processes.
I think Lizzie's question there around the external incident, if the parties recognise that it's impacting on their ability to work together, then I would absolutely encourage them to go down the mediation route. And the point made earlier that once an informal conversation has been had to share with the benefits of mediation and explain the process, then most people do buy into it.
Absolutely. There's a comment from Irene about the fact that you, Fiona, alluded to the trend of mediation coming from the voluntary and charity sector, and about the factors that may drive this, and the comment being made that it's often cash strapped. And I think mediation is a very cost-effective route for resolution. I mean, as was mentioned, tribunals can be incredibly expensive and drawn out, and deeply unpleasant, and the cost of getting expensive people involved to try and resolve it is often disproportionate, whereas mediation can offer a solution, and with lower pricing and fixed pricing, it gives people much more certainty. So I totally agree with Irene's comment there. Sharon has asked the question, can you give examples or any examples of how mediators can contribute to the sustainability of the agreement reached, or recommend support methods to HR?
Yeah, I'm happy to share my preferred way of working, which is that when at the end of the mediation process, you draw up a settlement agreement, and that settlement agreement tends to be as long or short as the parties wish it to be, and it can be shared with whomever they wish it to be shared with. And my usual position is to try and encourage the parties to share that settlement mediation agreement with somebody in the organisation, typically the HR director or HR manager. But I don't force them, because we keep talking about the confidentiality of the process, and it is a confidential process. But if the parties, they very often want somebody in the organisation to then take them by the hand and say, okay, then let's make sure we embed the settlement agreement. And to that point, quite often my settlement agreements tend to be quite long. Not always, but often. So in answer to the question, I would say if you can get the parties to agree to share it, that will help maintain the sustainability of what they've agreed to.
Totally agree with that. And you can be quite specific in behaviours agreement about how people will agree to work together. And you can, and I also agree with Irene's comment on the chat there about offering a review in 2 or 3 months down the track. I think that is that's really welcome, part of the sustainability of the process.
There's another question. What would your advice be if one of the parties breached the confidentiality in terms of what took place and was discussed during the mediation? I mean, I think that's a contractual issue if they breach the mediation confidentiality terms, because it sits under the mediation agreement. And I think I don't know how often that happens, and of course it does happen. And I think you could say to the person, you know, look, you're under a duty of confidentiality, and you've breached it, and this must go no further. What action you take thereafter would depend on the severity of that breach. But I think the mediators that we work with, in Mediator Cater and everybody I know, they do stress very much at the outset the confidential nature of the process. And I think, you know, it's important when we start a mediation that the parties understand this and they respect this. So hopefully by making it front and center at the start of the mediation, it limits the opportunity for people to subsequently breach the terms of that agreement.
And ultimately it'd be a question for the employer, wouldn't it, as to whether they wanted to take any action if they both remained in employment. Yeah, I have seen an increase in claimants wanting to refer to what happened in mediation in employment tribunals, but so far the judges have been pretty clear,
yeah,
around what can be admitted and what can't be admitted.
Yeah. And the guardrails are the mediation agreement at the outset for the process, and then the settlement agreement, Fiona, as you mentioned, at the conclusion of the process, and that settlement agreement is of contractual effect. Yeah. So.
I don't know whether there's any other questions, but just in case it's helpful to people, on the screen you'll see a QR code. Mediator, we've produced a mediation guide. It covers everything mediation related. It's got information in there, a little bit about neurodiversity, and there's quite a lot of valuable resources in there, for example, checklists and pre-mediation templates and so forth. So do feel free to download the guide, and it can certainly help you structure your mediation and hopefully improve the probability of getting a good outcome. And of course, if you do need a mediation or you'd like to have a chat, we'd be absolutely delighted to hear from you. And you can see from the quality of the presentations today that we've got tremendous depth and ability with regards to employment matters. So thank you for that. I see another question. When you refer to a settlement agreement, is this an agreement to settle the dispute rather than an exit strategy?
Yes, I think that's what I mean. I'd something might call it a resolution agreement to make it distinct from a settlement agreement in the legal compromise agreement sense. But yes, I think that, if you want to speaking for both of us, I think that's what we meant by you know, a resolution of the subject matter of the mediation.
Yeah. Can I ask a quick question? Just interested. Do people, when they mediate, do they did the mediator get too deeply involved in the terms of the settlement itself? Because the usual principle in mediation is the mediator will help the parties reach a resolution and will probably record that in a form of a heads of terms, but won't themselves draw up the agreement. I just wonder what people's experiences is in that regard.
Yeah, I tend to do heads of terms that the parties have agreed to, and then they can take that away. Often they don't need a formal settlement agreement, as I deal with on a day-to-day basis as an employment lawyer. But yes, if they did, then they'd take that away and get that drafted elsewhere.
That's great, thank you. Does anybody have any other questions or anything else they'd like to say?
Yes, I'd love to see a heads of terms sometime, because that strikes me as being much more straightforward and a faster way of concluding a mediation. I'd be fascinated to see that. I'll pick up with you if I may, Sharon. Sarah.
Very good. Well, unless anybody else has got anything else they'd like to raise, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to everybody who's given up their time this morning. I know how precious time is, and it's very much appreciated. And also a huge thank you to everybody who's spoken today. Really interesting insights. And as I've said before, I think you can see the depth and the quality of the people we have. So, do consider mediation, and we'd be delighted to help you and hear from you if you had any disputes that we could assist you with. Thank you very much. And as far as from my point of view, thank you and goodbye.